So welcome to Curated Conversations. This is our second series for January, February, and March, and we're going to talk about religion. Yeah, whoop, 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 whoop. And so as we always do, we're going to start by just kind of centering into the energy of the room, the energy of being here together. So if you want to, you can close your eyes. You don't have to. And just feel that vibration of God, of love, of the truth of who and what we are, connected to all that is. That amazing, wonderful vibration of good. And so we just settle into that, knowing that each one of us is here to listen, to express, to be heard, to just be in each other's company, and to honor who we are and why we're here. And so I just know this evening unfolds with grace, with ease, with laughter, and with a wonderful learning for all of us on what is this next topic, religion. And so I call it good, I call it God, and so it is. I'll introduce Reverend Bishop Edward Donaldson. And I'll let you introduce your guest. All of those titles.
Hello, family. Oh, it's so good to be back at Genesis. Happy New Year, everybody. I feel like it's been ages since we've been together. We haven't been in a curated conversation since November, but I was here for the installation for Pastor Gail, and I was so excited to be a part of that, and I didn't get to hug your necks because I had to run out and go to my community and pretend I pastor there. I have them all fooled. They think I'm their pastor, and so I go and do that, and that was good. So I want to say congratulations publicly to Pastor Gail, and to give my admiration for the job that you're doing, and to tell you how appreciative I am of the way you steward this community. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. Well, this evening I have the distinct honor and privilege to have a colleague and a friend and the Associate Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry with us tonight. Dr. Michael Trice is the Associate Dean of Ecumenical and Interreligious Dialogue at Seattle University. He is the Secretary of the World Parliament of Churches. He is an author, he is a lecturer, he is a bunch of things, but a good steak makes its own gravy, so I shan't be long in his resume. The longer you talk about someone, the less believable you become. So I want to introduce him to the Genesis family and the Genesis community, and I want to say that he is not a person who approaches this work of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue with only his head, but he engages this work from a deep place of passion around spirituality. And so his heart is engaged in the work as well as his head. It's our tradition to ground our talks in a little bit of work, and tonight's grounding comes from a book called Spirituality. What is it and why it matters? It's Roger S. Gottlieb. And this is what he says, and I'm going to take my glasses off so I can see. I'm at that age. I put them on to hear and take them off to see. In its broadest terms, spirituality is an understanding of how life should be lived and an attempt to live that way. A spiritually oriented life gives rise to certain characteristic experiences, and certain characteristics experiences may prompt the adoption of a spiritual perspective and motivate a spiritually oriented life. Spiritual teachings contain some perplexing paradoxes and have significant connections to and differences with morality, mysticism, and traditional religion. Overall, the attempt to live spiritually is a lifelong striving beset with a variety of challenges and long-term labors, including, ironically, the labor of learning how to stop laboring too hard. Tonight we want to open up our series on religion from that place of understanding the deep connection that we all have as we attempt and strive to live spiritual lives in the universe. And whatever our religious practice is that comes out of that attempt to live a spiritual life in the universe, we have one thing in common. At the core of it all, we're attempting to navigate a human experience. And so that's the place from which we'll start. Michael, would you like to say something to open up before I jump into questions?
Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. It's always nice to be colleagues, but you never know how you're going to reference the other until you're in a chance. It's like, oh, you're so much. Thank you for saying such a nice thing about me. I appreciate it. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be a colleague to Dr. Donaldson, because we've known each other for a number of years now, and I think, if anything, the whole quest for understanding the role of religion in society is a journey you never reach, the completion of which you never really reach. And I never thought, just by way of self-referencing, I mean, I serve in the Parliament now, and as you mentioned at the university, this was not the life I intended, actually. I thought I might be a lawyer. I worked in death penalty appeal in North Carolina. I was kind of moving in that direction, and then went to graduate school, and it just struck me that the earnest, important, kind of meaning-making questions that were shaping my life found answers in a lot of different kinds of venues. But one of those was in the study of religion. So I approached religion first, I think, through the sciences in terms of sociology of religion, and then moved, I had a background in philosophy, and just felt like there was lots of resonance between all these different ways of knowing. And I was impressed by how religion can be a force for good in the world, and also depressed in ways in which religion can become used and malformed as a kind of diabolical force in the world, which I hope we can also talk about. I mean, both of those and a lot of gray in the middle are true. So for me, it became a very personal journey that was taking place alongside others, such as you and other colleagues, and friends. So I really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight and to just have some conversation together. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's jump right in. Yeah, pretty good, huh? It's pretty good. I'm going to recommend that they hire him again next year.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's jump in. Let's do a little bit of academic work. How do you, as a theologian, define religion?
It was nice enough to receive these questions a little bit in advance. And what I don't want to do is provide an exhaustive response, because I don't think that's helpful, and because that would take a long time, more time than we have. But let me just say a few words about even the word religion itself, which is often misconstrued to be identical with organized religion. Those are really two different things. The earlier and probably the earliest terminology that we have, and I'm going to draw first from Latin, the term religio actually means to bind together. That's what that word means. So what does it mean to be bound together, like the sinews of a body, where all of those different parts of the body are in a kind of cooperative relationship with one another that is non-competitive and that is seeking the best of all of those in the community. So when I think of religion first as the religio, it's in that kind of elemental, proto, later organized religion kind of sensibility. And a lot of what happens after becomes kind of shaped around like the layers of an onion around that central core. But if that core is missing, if that sense, an underlying sense of unity is missing, then it slowly starts to erode, and then you have something that becomes a contagion. There become conflicts, other things happen, and it just kind of gives. The center doesn't hold. There's another term, though, that I would use that you find across religions. This one primarily from Christianity, but not exclusively in terms of its concept. And it's this word koinonia in Greek, which means fellowship. And it's interesting when you see these early debates in religions. Every religion has them. There's a period where you go through a lot of conflict. That terms like koinonia or fellowship, identity, connection, even amidst the controversy, seems to outlast the strife. So so there's that kind of glue that holds the religio together. The sense of, are we going to be connected in fellowship like the sinews or not? It doesn't mean, perhaps using today's language of the way we're using technology, that we need to find matching algorithms as though everything we say has to be in agreement. That's not it. In fact, it's better if it's not. And we have great writers on religion who talk about the essential nature of variety. Without variety, you get too much of a kind of monolithic identity in the religio, and there's something about the community that requires distinctions that give life. It's like biodiversity. You have to have biodiversity in the planet. So it's one thing for us to know this in a popular way and how we understand perhaps our own walk, but it's also interesting to go back 2,000, 3,000 years and have this affirmed, and how those earliest communities define themselves. It means that our hunches about the role of the religio are confirmed by the arc of time and the human experience across time. And I think that's incredibly affirmative in moments where I see the abuse or misuse of religion and wonder what it means to perpetuate that in society. Does that make sense? So let me just say one other word. Usually, where the religio breaks down, I find, if you look across religions and the work I've done, is in this this difficult relationship between unity and truth. So that we want to be right, and we'll be right at the expense of our unity, and there will be others who will say, how could you forfeit our unity for the sake of being right? And usually the religio gets fractured somewhere in the identity politics between what it means to be a community together, or and that unity has the highest value, or to be correct. I think we see that in family dynamics too. I mean, I can see that with my 12-year-old daughter, who I realize she needs to be right now, and the unity of the family is not something I need to press, you know. So I think those are the initial comments I would have about the religio.
I'm fascinated by this idea of being bound together, right? In light of what we're experiencing in our culture as a group of people who identify themselves as spiritual, but not religious, right? And so, or we call them SB&Rs. And this really says, I have a spirituality, but my spirituality is not joined with, in communion with, in community with. And can one really be spiritual if there is no bonding together? Is it true that there is essence that is personal and individual that is not also unified with the one? So I'm really curious as how spiritual but not religious we'll talk about, and I know that they are referencing organized religion, but we as a culture have a very shallow read of things now. And so we don't really look in depth at even what our nomenclatures are saying about who we really are. So that's fascinating, and I'm really fascinated. The second word you talked about, I'm really fascinated because I begin to think about the ways in which we are siloed by our algorithms. And what happens in any family that is siloed is you have inbreeding. And what happens to us religiously when we are completely siloed is we begin to have inbreeding. And we begin to produce problematic personalities because our only thinking and our only exposure is reinforced by people who are in our own echo chamber. And there's no way for that echo chamber to allow growth and new life. And so that brings me to my second question then. What is ecumenism, and what's the difference between ecumenism and interreligious dialogue?
And there's some distinct differences. Can I make a comment to what you just said?
Please do.
This
My
really,
goodness.
it seems what I'm hearing in terms of what leadership in different religions, so more organized religion, are saying about the role of religion today is that we live at what's called a post-structuralist age, which is to say the structures that served us well, however long, however complicated, not just in religion but across society, are changing the way we think about meaning making itself and what counts for truth. What can I rely on, for instance? So I remember being on an airplane. I guess you can make this up, but I was on an airplane. I'm always interested in religion. I looked over at someone, and there was a Zoroastrian sitting next to me. I don't get a chance to talk very often with Zoroastrians. So we started talking about youth and family, and spiritual but not religious came up in the conversation. He said, I have so many members of my community who talk about being spiritual but not religious. So here's this cross-religious challenge. I said, oh yeah, I see that in my community too. And part of it is just, I think you're right. If I understood, there's a resistance to what we think is organized religion in naming the spiritual but not religious. And resistance is good. It's not that that's a bad thing. It's just simply that you can see it across society, and that's interesting. I think when you see resistance, patterns of resistance, because there's still a positive claim in that. And one of the positive claims to your second question on ecumenism goes way back and this is really in the early Christian experience, 2nd century, 3rd century. It comes out of the Greek word ekumene, which means the whole inhabited house of God. It means that everyone is inside the whole inhabited house, and there are these really beautiful texts in the Christian scriptures, for instance, in the book of Ephesians, that talks about all human beings being living stones in the spiritual household of God. I can get behind that. I think that's interesting. Spiritual beings in the living, spiritual stones in the household of God. And early ecumenism meant that. It took place really early in Asia Minor, which would be right around the Mediterranean in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. There was a lot of conflict, and Christianity at that time had a minority place in the kind of social fabric. And there was a lot to be concerned about. These were little house churches, kind of peppered throughout the area. And so ecumenical really meant both the connection of the whole inhabited house in that little house church and between these peppered kind of ecclesial or church realities. There was a real feeling of vulnerability. I don't think in some ways it's unlike what we experience today. A sense of some porousness, a sense that the state or some other external force could impose itself upon you, whoever you are, as that early religious community. A lot of creativity that also came out of a time of crisis. So why waste an opportunity when you have a crisis like this? But unity was seen as the gift. Going back to that word religio, unity was interpreted at that time as the gift, and the scandal of the early ecumenical walk was disunity. That was it. Because if you weren't unified, all those external forces that, irrespective of our differences we may have with one another, if you're not unified, those external forces already have a foothold in terms of how they can shape the future of the community. So it's like I come from a large kind of German family, and we had neighbors who came from a large Irish family, and I was always surprised, like the Irish family really stuck together in a way that even intimidated me sometimes. Like this, like, we're kind of like, you could choose one to kind of pick on, but all the brothers would show up. So you picked on one, you picked on everyone. That's what I mean by the early community. This sense of unity within theirs. And finally, ecumenical in that early sense means a deep commitment to solidarity, and solidarity always implies a commitment to justice. So you find in the early Christian ecumenical experience a commitment to justice that's almost like genetically infused. Now, it doesn't mean that Christians get that right all the time by any stretch, but it just means there's this genetically infused sense that if anyone stands for injustice, somehow that's a non-starter. Let me just say one more word. In a context today nationally, where there are a lot of differences between Christians about the role of justice in society, there's significant disunity and a lot of heartache about how to read texts as normative for life when you're dealing with major issues, addressing everything from gender relations to interreligious dialogue to kind of morality, fundamental moralities, human sexuality. Like all of that is taking place in our society, and it's creating, understandably, a lot of disunity. I hope that that question kind of moved in a couple different places, but
I think the gift of being here in a Center for Spiritual Living, the gift of the New Thought movement, Unity, Centers for Spiritual Living, Agent, is if we, from a very neophyte understanding of Ernest Holmes, if we take seriously science of mind, that the back of all things is one, then this idea of being ecumenical and interreligious is normative to the identity of what it means to be a Center for Spiritual Living. And so anything that shows up as division or divisiveness is not natural or germane to the underlying theology, philosophy of what it means to be in a Center for Spiritual Living. So this conversation about multiple faith, multiple religious belonging, interfaith, interreligious dialogue is germane to who we are as a community, as our identity, right? That's the gift. And I say that coming from a fundamentalist, evangelical, Pentecostal background where that is not the gift, right? We had this thing, who's going to heaven? Us four and no more, right? that was it. We were God's chosen few, and you could be one of God's chosen few. But the organization that I came out of had a song that we sung. It's the theme song. This is the church of God in Christ. This is the church of God in Christ. You cannot join it. You have to be born in it. This is the church of God in Christ, right? And we sung it, and we meant it. You can't join. You have to be born in it. And not to say you had to be physically born, but there was this theology of being born again. But what we were really communicating is if you're not one of us, then you're not really religious at all. And that's not the way of being in Centers for Spiritual Living. That's not the way of being in unity. However, all of us have a tendency toward becoming fundamentalists in whatever it is we are a part of. So even understanding that the back of all things is one, understanding that all there is truth, we have a way of being exclusive. That if that's not your language or way of being or way of understanding, then you're somehow other. And we can other people in our liberty and in our ability to understand and to pursue truth. And so I wanted to lift that up in this community to say it is good to continue to have this conversation because it is good to remind ourselves of what we know is true in this moment as it relates to what we're taught. How do all religions, in your estimation, and this is something that in our community right now on Thursday nights I'm teaching a series on The Wiz, the musical The Wiz, and putting The Wiz in conversation with Christian texts because I am trying to help our community see the Christian text as a belonging to deep mythology. And so it takes mythology to be in conversation with mythology. And so my question for you is, how do all religions share common myth?
It's I loved when you gave me this question because I thought, oh, there's such good material here. I mean, I don't know how you were raised, but I was raised in believing that myths were like fake news. There's fact and then there's everything else. In this discourse. And a couple of us are writing a book right now, an astrophysicist, a genomicist, and myself are writing a book on shared myth. It addresses shared myth because myth comes from this idea of mythos, which means the stories that shape our lives. So what are the stories that shape our lives? And I often think of those early human communities that would gather around fire circles You'd know they were there because you'd always see a fire circle, and the stories that they would say about internality in terms of what's right around the fire circle, us as a community, and what's out there in the trees and external, and the sense of the flame that gathers in. I mean, this is really tangible, how those narratives would shape shared life, shared values, shared principles, a sense of kind of connectedness and belonging. So first I would say that religions share the capacity to make meaning like that. That you can, as an archaeologist, see a fire circle from 5,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, as we discovered in caves recently in France, and those archaeologists knew pretty quickly what that space was for. Certainly had religious meaning. There was artifacts and other things that were meaningful, but the fact that there was a place where people convened was a central kind of human characteristic of how we shape stories. So I would say first it's the stories, and those stories have huge symbolic power, which can shape our lives for the good or for the ill. So think of your own families, and what are the myths that shape your families? And what are the parts of those myths that are the symbols inside of them that shape your story? So for instance, a few of us were studying recently, I don't know if you know the story of Cain and Abel. The story, Cain, you find this across religions, kills his brother Abel. So that's a foundational myth. You find fratricide across religions. He kills his brother Abel with a knife that in Hebrew means scandal. So the scandal of our disunity is our capacity to murder our brethren. Like this is also what happens inside the human experience. So those are the kinds of myths and stories. And killing isn't always a physical killing. There's emotional killing. There's all kinds of different ways of slashing and creating a scandal, a disruption. So I think, but if I had to choose some of the shared myths that you see across religions, and we could talk at length about any of these if you wanted to, fundamentally, religions that are forces for unity, this religio, all have myths that address the following questions. Who are we? Who am I in the we? How did I and we get here? Where are we going? What does God or the cosmos want of us? And these are formative mythical structures that aren't highly intellectualized first. They're not cogitized, and then we talk about them. I think of my 12-year-old daughter. When she was 4, I came back from riding my bike one night, and we were living in Chicago, and she'd waited up really conscientiously. I walked into her room, and she was sitting up kind of looking at me. And I said, I was out riding my bike, and I saw the stars. The stars are a symbol of something, like these little points of light, illumination, epiphany points out there in the world. And at 4, she could look at me and say, oh, I meant to ask you this as earnestly as she could. What are the stars for? What a great question. So the really poignant myths and narratives respond to those fundamental questions, and then they respond to them in a myriad of ways. But those myths are strongest when there is a symbol around them like a star. And you see that in religious festivities and holidays. Little points of light around a room. I mean, it all has symbolic power. So I think they share those myths, and where I think we get it wrong, if I could just say, is where those myths become enshrined in a kind of doctrinal reality. I don't mean any particular religion's doctrine, but I mean an inflexible kind of crust that refuses to see the needs of community, where the spirit of the thing, the spirit of the doctrine is left aside, and it really becomes a matter of law and of enforcement. When that happens, the center doesn't hold either. So myths have a kind of flexibility in them. Symbols have a kind of flexibility, and when stories become too encoded, it tends to actually become problematic and erosive for the community itself. So it's dynamic. Myths are meant not to be passive, just like our lives are meant to be dynamic and kind of in flux and experiments and sources of new discovery.
It's interesting when we talk about myth as it relates to religious meaning making, that we're careful not to reduce myth to the level of folklore. Because we're not talking about the story of the people that rises from amongst this particular people that contextualizes our community, right? But we're talking about that which contextualizes our humanness. There's a few things that myths do for us that folklores don't quite get at. Myths open up the cosmological, right? As you talked about the stars but myths also open up a pedagogy for us, like how do we be human? Not how do I be a good black man in America? How do I be human? How do I exist from birth through life to death and beyond? There's that pedagogy that's in there that myths teach us, and there's a couple other things. Myths open up mystery, right? They're about the big stories. So as we consider our own religious mythology, it is easy then to understand someone else's religious mythology because it is their way of making meaning of some really big questions, right? And you may not make meaning of the big questions in the same way that I do. And so I will go to a Catholic church and I will see a liturgical structure that's quite different than what I experience here at Genesis. And I will know that is just an enculturated expression of how you make meaning of the universe. And then I cannot be unmoored by that. I'm actually welcomed into it, because now I understand that your symbolism and your ritual is really about the way you're making meaning in the world. And if you can explain that to me, then we can share something, because it's about what it means to be human. It's not really what it means to be a good Catholic, or what does it mean to be a good Baptist, or what does it mean to be a good Buddhist. It's what does it mean to make meaning in the world in a religious together sense. And then I am at home in every religion, aren't I? I'm at home in every spirituality, aren't I? Because I'm human, and there is something of your humanity that I can make meaning together with you in the way that you make meaning and still be okay, right? And that doesn't take away my particularity, because I will always find community for my particularity, but it does expand my universality. And it makes me then a citizen of humanity with a particular location within that. We've talked a long time, and maybe too long, but I'll ask one last question.
I'll be brief. I promise. I will. If I'm not, just raise your hand and go, okay, brevity over.
So I also want to acknowledge and celebrate and congratulate that this Sunday, Michael is going to be ordained as a Lutheran this Sunday, and he took time out this week of his ordination to be here with us. Can you help me acknowledge that? Thank you. Field trip, right?
You're all invited.
You're invited. 2:00 on the campus of Seattle U in Campion Hall. It is open for everyone. Please come. I will be there. Please come and celebrate with us. So, in your work that you do, and you do a lot of it, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing us? That's where I'll kind of park this.
You know, I'm a little disappointed in myself, because I wanted to just nail the answer to this question, because I thought there's so much happening in the world that it should be self-evident. And I think part of if I could name 4, the first would be the problem we're experiencing is that it's not as self-evident as we think it is. Otherwise, we'd name it and be working our way toward its resolution. There's something happening in the human experience today that isn't reducible to just the rise of, say, popular nationalism in the world, or any other kind of ideology. There's something else that's happening to us that's requiring our attention, and it's creating all kinds of dissonance with dire effect on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm writing this book with this astrophysicist on the one hand and genomicist on the other, and the kinds of scientific discoveries that are taking place right now in galaxies far away or in the interior galaxy, which is, I think, equally as complex, is awe-inspiring. Talk about mystery. I mean, it just inspires the imagination. And we know now more about the out there and the in here in that way than we've ever known in the history of our species. So I don't want you to feel like I'm just bemoaning our state. I'm also inspired, and part of the tragedy is that both coexist at once right now, I think, in the world. The scandal of our ambivalence to what's happening around us, the failure to see kind of, I'm going to call it polycentricities, instead of, by that is kind of the polycentric responses, the polycentric questions, to our failure not to see what's happening to us as complex, like a layered cake, and instead to look for the kind of simple responses. We see that nationally, I think, if I may say. We see that also internationally, where if we can just get on the same agenda, and if I can force my agenda, I know it'll be the right choice for everyone. That doesn't seem to be very effective, and history proves that. I think our inability to interpret and translate hope today in concrete ways, that hope isn't this ethereal, the things that we believe, our values that shape our lives, our families, the stories I tell my daughter Bridget when she goes to sleep around hope and truth and solidarity and courage and resiliency and resistance, that all of these are not ethereal. Like, they take up residence in our lives, and I think we're displacing the gravity of those things. And finally, somehow we become more balkanized, and there's a growing refusal to accept different ways of knowing external to our own without that being a threat. And I think there's an amalgam of challenges that I would say are somewhere in that orbit. And my fear, in a really honest moment, without being a cynic, is that I had a lot more faith in our species a year ago than I do now. I've never said this like publicly, and I apologize. I don't just have this land on you. I'm questioning our capacities right now to meet these challenges in a way we have to, and I think we will. I'm confident we will, but it's just going to be a long road, and that road will probably outlast most of us in the room. I think that's right.
There's an African proverb that says we sit on an old mat weaving a new one, which for me has been my metaphor around change as a bishop, as a pastor. When our congregation begin to take a turn to a more Metacostal framework, and as I begin to embrace new thought and try to marry what I understand of new thought to classical Pentecostalism, which is not an easy task, let me tell you. That became, I picked something hard to do with my life. But that became kind of my grounding, is that you can't snatch a rug from under people or they'll fall. You have to help them weave a new mat and lay it down and then move to stand on that mat. And I think what is happening to us culturally as we see the unraveling of Western society is that we are unaware of a new mat being weaved. Who are the mat weavers? But our mat is being taken out from under us, and we don't know if we're going to stand. I think these conversations weave for us a new mat to stand on, a new way of being in the world. But as you can see, these conversations are not highly populated. Not yet. And so they're not in the sound bites of CNN, and they're not even in the radar of Fox. And in our hyper-digital world, the anxiety that goes with not knowing that they are even happening is causing a sense of being unmoored in people. And I think there's not a way that we name that sense of being unmoored without having deeper conversations about what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be fundamentally spiritual, what is community, what are faithful community values. Those conversations have to be happening as we create something that is not imperialist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal norms. And once we start moving past that, then we can imagine a new world, right? Thank you.
Thank you.
For your insight and for your wisdom and your knowledge and for bringing your person to the table. Now, children, beloved, there are not a lot of us. So you cannot wait for your neighbor to ask a question tonight because it's just us. So if you have questions, would you please come to the mic at this time? We are here to answer them. And we've been asked by our camera person that you would speak directly into the mic so that you can be heard. So we're open for questions, if there are any. Yes, there is question.
I'm on now. There we go. So I had no idea that this was the topic today. And I'm driving back early this morning from Portland. And there are a lot of religious radio shows on at that hour. And I kept flipping, trying to find something that was positive. And I kind of got on one channel and I'm listening. And it was, I am not worthy of your love. You know, I am a sinner. And so there's all this, oh, that's just awful. How do we, no wonder we have this big split with people, with religion, because you've got the fundamental makeup of some churches where they're constantly damning you, and then where we're over here where love is everything. And but it's, I think, looking at the Bible, I've learned in the last couple of years as I've been trying to translate it, it's almost like it's a Reader's Digest or a here's how to live for dummies. If you read between the lines and you don't take it literally. Thank you, that was the word I was looking for. And so I guess I look at it as that, is there something I'm missing out there? Because it seems pretty darn easy when you read a lot of the different texts that they're all saying the same thing. Love thy neighbor, be nice. You do this to somebody and it's going to come back to you tenfold. I mean, it's just everywhere. How do we get to the point where it's that simplistic? Like, I look at it as, that's simple. Why doesn't everybody catch on to it? And how come we have things like the radio program, you know, you sinner and I ain't worthy of you, on the radio in the morning? Is that supposed to pick people up? So, I mean, and so in your realm, in working in teaching religion, or even studying it, because I don't think you can teach it, is studying it, how are we coming back to that, the fundamentals of what basically all the forefathers put out there? It's, why aren't we there? How come we are so way off in left field with some of the religions, and how come some people are over here getting it, or at least in my book is getting it? You know, there's many paths. There's so many paths to God, and I just see that this could be simple. I don't know if there's a question in that, but it was interesting about that whole "you are a sinner" thing. Woohoo! Good morning to you. All right.
I feel that way when I turn on the AM radio on a long trip. I drove back to Chicago over the holidays, and I had a number of stations like this. I'm always fascinated, so I'm turning them up and listening to what's the narrative, like what's the myth, you know? What are the values, and how are those values supposed to impact my life besides igniting a kind of guilt consciousness that I can't do anything with in that particular moment, that doesn't feed the external community, and which it seems to me also cuts into that kind of unity I'm supposed to be living into by singling out me in my own finitude and naming me something contrary to the love and life that God hopes I'm going to be participating in the world. It creates a psychosocial crisis if you listen, I think, to too much of it. Now, there are different families of faith where that language means something in terms of the myth and the symbols, so that maybe I'm not supposed to hear it in that kind of precise manner. But a lot of the radio shows, I think, and other forms of media today count on an active viewership, listeningship, of people who are paying attention and are somewhat alarmed by this kind of narrative. You know what concerns me even more, I think, if you just if you amplify this a little further, is those kinds of messages in society, either on the radio or any kind of plurality of all the stuff that's going on in the social media, that use religion as a foil for hate, either of yourself, kind of self-animosity, which is really hard to kind of get out external from, or hate for others you've never met but have some sort of archetypal idea of who they are. You'll know them when you see them. And we have enough of that, I think, in our country. Like, we've developed a history of creating a fear-based or xenophobic response, both to our own interior life and to others. Religio, at its best, is supposed to be an emancipatory power from all of that. So I ask myself similar questions about why that exists the way it does. Something like, why as human beings do we require somehow that static out there, which has such a pull? And in moments where I've known some individuals, where I worked in death penalty appeal, for instance, where some individuals have been, and this is where I really struggle sometimes, where some individuals have had messages like that become a redemptive power in their lives, because they've been able to see and contend with their own choices, and also talk about, for many Christians, a road of both from death to resurrection. Now, I come out of a Lutheran experience where the gift of grace is supposed to be a defining characteristic of our lives. And grace as a gift is a love I can't fully conceptualize or define or articulate, but part of my letting go is recognizing I can't do those things. And that's good, because of my desire to control things. That's a part of who I am. So I think that's how I would first respond. I would finally just say there are a lot of people who hear messages. This is the thing about the different ways of knowing, if I may. I may not agree with that message. I'm on the AM radio, I'm driving through the middle of Nebraska, it could be any state, and I'm listening to the very kind of diatribe you're mentioning, and I'm asking myself, who is listening to this out there? I don't know, but there's an audio ship out there, right? Being me, I should have called you. I know you're in Washington. I'm in Nebraska. Who knew? What do you think of this? So there's a I don't want to overly insinuate myself in all this in such a way that there might not be a possibility that that's redemptive for other people's lives in ways I can't see. Where I get cautious is where it becomes a mass social movement, which is debilitative of our shared humanity, and that's really worrying, in whatever form, in whatever religion.
I don't have an answer. I think I more approach it from a place of curiosity. And my curiosity is around motive and intent. When I hear those messages, I always ask myself, who is empowered by this and who is disempowered? And to what end? And so I'm always looking beyond the message to interrogate the messenger, and then and then to find out what is the intent behind the message. Because at its best, when we assume positive intent, it is calling people to an accountability for areas in which they may be experiencing brokenness, or areas in which they may recognize their own lack. And at its worst, it is a system of control, domination, manipulation, right? And I don't know what it is when I'm hearing it on the radio, but I'm really curious about what the intent is and how an individual or a group of individuals have navigated themselves to that space as a product of what is known as the black church. There is a lot of that conversation that happens in black church space around sin and evil and hell and God as master, but it is because black people in America learned Christianity in particular from their slave owners. So now you have oppression sickness because you believe about yourself the same thing your oppressor believes about you. And so then we have to have a conversation about how to move us from religious oppression into religious freedom. But the intent now and the intent then were very different. And so you have to be careful not to damn the now by its original intent, because over the course of time that intent has shifted and changed, and so it's a tightly woven system of problems, right? It's a wicked problem, scholars would say, in that when you pull out one thread, there's a million other threads attached to it. So it always lifts me to the level of curiosity. Yeah. Yes.
One of the things that you said really struck me. It's what I think my family, who's from Springfield, Illinois, just a little bit south of Chicago, what they feel like in today's world. And that is the mat has been yanked out from under them. And they have no faith or hope that there is another mat being woven at the same time. And the idea then that they have to be right versus being unified is splitting lots of families, some including my own, apart, and at times. And so how do I help create that new story, the new myth, that is unifying? How do I convey or imagine a new world that these people who are hopeless can find hope in? And I know I can't do that really, but I can't be ambivalent. And I have fallen into that. And so I don't want to be. And so again, any ideas on, how to create a new story?
So, do you mind if I start? For me, I understand religion as humanity's response to trauma. The trauma of not knowing, the trauma of awareness, right? It is traumatic to become self-aware. Look, this idea of being human is just traumatic. And so we tap into the mythos in order to respond to the trauma of self-awareness. And what we're looking for when we craft our religious narrative is safety. And the only way that I see to help people, because what you're describing is their response to a feeling of trauma, and they don't feel safe. And so you then become active in engaging a safe dialogue and a safe way of being. That if you don't get it right and you don't say the right thing and you don't understand the world as it is, it's still going to be safe for you. So that as what you are losing as identity slips away, you're still safe until something else replaces it. I'll give you an example. My father is 76 years old. He's a 76-year-old black man from West Philadelphia. That comes with a lot of stuff, right? He went to work for Boeing in 1968 as the only black air traffic controller for the company. He retired in 2010 as the only black air traffic controller, right? He's got some experiences. He's got a way of being in the world. He's been married to my mother 50 plus years. One woman, never separated, no divorces, no women on the side that I know of, no, right? There's a way. There's a way he shows up in the world as a man. There's a way he shows up in the world. And I made a decision that our restrooms in the church that he founded were going to be gender neutral restrooms. And I made this announcement and said, We are now going to have gender-neutral restrooms because God's transgender children need some place to pee. And so he didn't say anything, but I could tell this was going to be a conversation later. So about a week, 2 weeks passed, and I was at my parents' house, and this is the beautiful thing about him as a 76-year-old man. He would never challenge me at the church as the leader. But he waited until I was in his house. And I sat down to eat, and he sat down and he looked across the table. He said, "Now, son, don't you think we ought to talk about these bathrooms?" Of course, I wasn't thinking anything about the bathrooms at the church. I said, "What's wrong with your bathroom? We need to get a plumber?" He says, "There's nothing wrong with my bathroom. It's the church. What are we going to do?" You say everybody's going to the gender neutral. What does that mean? What are you going to do with the toilet, son? I said, "Daddy, on Sundays, if the women's restroom is full, what do the women do?" He said, "Well, they go to the men's room." I said, "And if someone's in the men's room, what do the men do?" He said, "Why, they go to the women's room." I said, "Our restrooms are already gender neutral. I'm just going to put up a sign and let people know." He said, "Oh, all right. Well, I reckon that settles that." And he sat back. I made it safe. I didn't make it about his patriarchy. I didn't make it about heteronormativity. I didn't make it about words that just don't register in his orbit, because it didn't need to be about that. It needed to be about him being comfortable at church. So how do we have a conversation that makes you safe? That this is already happening. Like, we're just going to put up signs that say, when that one's full, go to this one. And when that one's full, go to this one. He said, "Yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah, you can't hold it, son. You just can't hold it." And he was fine because it was safety. And our job is to be agents of safety. How do I make you safe in a particular moment, even if I fundamentally disagree with the place you jump in the river at? Yeah. When we think safety first, we have a lot of ways of showing up as love in the world. That's my thought.
I've got a brother-in-law who sounds a lot like the family that was just described. And I hear a lot from students, and I think we all probably hear this in our private conversations with friends and other members of our family, that there seems to be discordant groupings, balkanized or new tribalisms, whatever we call those, that in our society now cut through even the families themselves, where our values were shaped. And that's painful when that happens. This is true of my brother-in-law, who just doesn't have a desire, I think, to engage the conversation. So where am I in that? Like, I have to try to understand where he is. My only recourse is not to truth, because I know where I stand on issues. And proving that to my brother in some sort of logical sequence and rational is contrary to actually how myths and narratives get constructed. They don't get constructed in kind of rational argument. They're much more closer to the heart, existentially impactful. So my brother-in-law feels a bit dispossessed, decentered, like he doesn't recognize the home he used to call home. He still has a shelter, it just doesn't feel like a home. He doesn't sense in his displacement, and I'm not just describing my brother, a lot of people feel this in this country, that he has recourse to the kinds of things that he can have hope in. And he's being convinced, as I think other people are being convinced, that the adversary in his midst is not a conversation partner, but is instead an enemy. And there's a difference between, especially around, I think, a Thanksgiving table where, your family member becomes, adversarial relationships are actually okay at times because they can be really helpful in refining and sharpening the mirror we see of ourselves in the other. But creating the enigma or the enemy is painful, especially when that happens in families. So here's what I do. I have nothing to win by attempting to bring him to some sort of truth that I may think is going to be good for his life. In fact, it says a lot about me if I really want to do that, because he doesn't want me to do that. I have respect for him in a way that I realize that's probably not my role anyway. I don't think I'm wrong, but that's inconsequential. What really matters is the unity of the family, not the truth of the argument I think I need to win. So I try to get very close to his perspective. I sidle up right next to him. We have conversations about vulnerability and what's difficult in society and what are we seeing, and that person so-and-so, wherever that person may be, and I'm listening intently to try to get into the stream of his fear. And if I'm in the stream of his fear, then I can talk with him about the experience without that being one more demeaning thing that he may be feeling. And whether he's feeling that legitimately or illegitimately isn't the point. The point is he's feeling it. And part of then, just in terms of family dynamics, is empathy. Empathy, putting myself in the place of the other, which may seem like it's just so easy to do until that family member says something that's just so wrong and so unprincipled and so contrary to the mythos that shapes your life that you think, were we ever around the same fire circle? Who are you? And that's where we really have to take a deep breath, I think. It doesn't mean there aren't moments where I tell my brother, because empathy that's constant listening without any kind of recognition of I have presence too doesn't do any service to any of us. There are things that can be said in a room that are diabolical that have to be addressed. We haven't had to do that, but I'm mindful that I've got one brother-in-law, and I've got one uncle, and I've got one sister, and these people are going to be in the arc of my life, I hope, for decades to come. So what do I owe that arc? And what do I owe that community? And don't I owe a service to the country as well by staying connected to family even when it hurts? That's not the case in every case. There are reasons why families have to split up. But just taking your example here, that's how I'm addressing it.
Is there another question? Now don't all pop up like popcorn. Here comes one. That's coming to the question. Courtney has a second interview, and we know that all is already well, and all will be well. And so I'm just getting you warmed up for a second interview, right? So step up to the mic and give me that interview personality that you're going to give them.
I don't have a question. I actually just want to say I didn't believe in organized religion until I started coming here to Genesis. My family's Catholic, though my parents divorced when I was 1, so we didn't go to church, but the rest of my family's Catholic. And I just didn't believe in it. There was too many rules. And then when I started coming to Genesis 8.5 years ago, somebody said, that is organized religion. And I was like, no, it's not, And honesty, I didn't even want to come tonight. I love these conversations about religion. I'm just so resistant to the word. But my husband's running sound and wanted me to come, so I was like, okay, I'll come. But anyways, I didn't want it, I wanted you guys to keep going, and I didn't want you to stop. And I really appreciate what you guys have said. And the thing about the mat, oh my God, light bulbs going off in my head, because as a society right now, or how I feel in our society right now, is that the rug is being pulled out from underneath of us, and it is unsteady ground of where our society is going right now. I do think that I do have hope that we're going to get there, because this kind of conversation is happening everywhere. It's just a matter of getting there. But I just wanted to say thank you, and that I really, really, really appreciate what you guys have had to say tonight. Anyways. And that's my interview personality.
That's right. Nailed it.
Got it.
Nailed
You're
it.
hired.
I want to say thank you for lifting that in this space, And one of the gifts that fundamentalism gave me was the story of the resurrection. And I often tell my church, we are people of the resurrection. So when 45 was put in office, is that how you say that? When 45 ascended to the throne, I don't know what happened, but when it happened, and I went to church that Sunday and people were grieving, and I mean it was so heavy and so thick in our atmosphere, and yet we did have congregants who thought that this was the best thing that ever happened since sliced bread, and you have to navigate that in a community, right? So what I said to them is, I said, you know, we are people of the resurrection, which means we are acquainted with death. But that my hope lies in the new life that always springs from death. And when I'm feeling like you, that it's just unstable ground, and that I'm just reminded of that death, that something is dying, but what is coming is greater than what's been. And we've been here as a society before. And we will be here as a society again until we all come into the perfection of what is perfect. And so that's the hope, the existential hope that has been the gift of our community, is that, you know, we've brushed up against death before. This isn't our first bull Connor. This is, you know, we've been at this rodeo. And the beauty about this time is we can see it. Like now we know, like evil is not masked. It has a face. It is personified. So then we can deal with what we can see and what is exposed, so that that which is perfect can come and is coming and has come and has already come. Yeah. Any other questions?
You know, religion has been blamed for a lot of, you know, wars and people dying. You know, when does I can't think of one religion in the world really that has mastered this moving through life. You know, there's just strife in just about every religion in the world. So when does it become that we get past all this? Like, one of the reasons why people don't like to even talk about religion is because it seems so ineffective. Like, we're constantly at war, you know, not just internationally, but personally, just like we've been talking about, you know, like in the neighborhood, in the state, in the country, everywhere. It's just this constant, you would think if that there were a religion that people accepted as meaningful, that group of people would at least be able to exist in a way with minimal strife, or you know, nobody would have to die. But I can't think of one place. So when do we start getting this right? Like, you know what I mean?
I love the comment made earlier. First of all, thank you for the question. Thank you all for the questions and for the comments and reflections, because these are all deeply felt and have an impact on our lives, even the way we ask them and the responses that we receive. And I was thinking of the comment made earlier. I forget exactly what it was, but the idea that Scripture, and every religion has different forms of Scripture, is like a, what was it called? Like a guidepost? It should, at its, pardon me? Living for Dummies. I love that, yeah. Like, Scripture has a kind of a self-evidence to it. Like, I should be able to read this, and everyone should have a sensibility to it, and recognize its truth value, like, immediately. And my response is that just take sacred texts for a moment. They really are a mirror. They're a mirror where we can echolocate ourselves in the narrative. Like, we see the worst of humanity in the mirror of Scripture. We see fratricide, I mentioned. I'm going to get to the good part in a moment. But we see a lot of death and irrationality, and we see rationality, and we see rationalizing death. We see all of that. We see brothers and sisters fighting. We see complicated communities at war. And all of the religions that I'm aware of have strife accounted for in their sacred texts. And yet, alongside that, they also have these threads of redemption. However that gets framed. You mentioned death to resurrection. Like there are these kind of in-breaking moments of divine inspiration is one way of putting it. And there are also, in the midst of all of this, these very clear codes. Talk about kind of moral genetic kind of structure in every religion that we often refer to as the golden rule in shorthand. And what strikes me is that there are very clear mandates in these religions for how we treat both ourselves and other human beings and the world around us. So that's a triad. There's always this kind of recognition that I will love and do unto others as I would love and do unto myself first. And this really is it's not just a moral imperative. It's like a pinwheel, that it shows me that I can't exist without the other human being, whoever that person may be, and I can't exist in the self-demolition that takes place in my own lack of recognition of my own life. Like all this coexists inside these golden rules. We often interpret them simply to love and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Those mandates are there. I'm not convinced that the role of religion as organized was ever to reach through those scriptures a kind of high point where we would all live in peace. We talk about it. We need it. We aspire toward it. It's aspirational. But history bears out that we have difficulty as human beings doing it. And part of the complexity of religion is seeing where hope has a definitive response to strife. Because every religion has an account of that. That in the end of the day, it's our hope and living in solidarity and peace that can be ours and that we get close to. That's the road it's pointing to, not to the strife. I think part of the response then is, how do I value what religion should be doing? Is religion a conduit to world peace? I serve in the Parliament of the World's Religions. If you ask the leadership there, they would say, well, we hope so. It should. We're not there yet, but it must be moving us toward world peace. It's an ongoing question. I live with the same, similar kind of recognition that, and this is how I talk about it with my own life. And my daughter and I keep mentioning her tonight for some reason, but we talk about this. And my father and I have similar kinds of conversations, my mother and I as well, in terms of these narratives inside Scripture that reflect both the best and the worst of us. And my hope, and what I'm telling my daughter in terms of the values that shape our lives, is that you need to be able to see both in order to know how to choose for what genuinely is hopeful and life-giving and peace-building in the world. And that there's no other force, there's no other narrative force that we have that draws people together in the world that has the power of emoting that kind of vision of a shared future. We have literature, we have music, we have other things, but religion, organized or not, those texts that have, many of which have existed for thousands of years, have a role in shaping a future, and we can resist that future. I think you're right to point that out. It hasn't happened. We can resist that future. It doesn't happen. But that doesn't mean it's not the aim. I recognize that is a totally unsatisfactory answer. And yet, I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't try to give you the most honest answer I could. I think it's the beginning of a conversation. But I can tell you, for me, in my moments where I wonder about the nature and meaning of life, I'm drawn to religion because it has a mythos and symbols in it that are like a deep well, a resource that is inexhaustible, and that teaches me more about my relationship with the cosmos and with the divine in a way that I am astounded by. in the kind of font of mystery.
I have not found religion yet that does not have shadow. That each of the religions have their shadow side, I have found to be true. And I think that brokenness is indicative of those shadow sides. My hope is that as we have these conversations and as we live into the idea of tearing down the walls that separate us, we bring the best of our traditions. We bring the best of our mythology. We bring the best of our understanding to the collective to expose where the best of your understanding has a shadow. And my best and your best get together and mutually expose shadow until shadow is no more. So that somewhere down the course of human history, we'll all come into a unity of faith, unto a perfect man, into a consciousness that is above the shadow. Do I see that happening in my lifetime? Yeah, probably not. No, I don't have that much longer to be here. But I do see that what it means to be human means to be moving toward that shadowless place. And that's my hope. That's my deep abiding hope. If there's no other questions, because I don't want to cut off anybody's question, Michael, do you have a summary statement?
I remember sitting with my father when he was dying 3 years ago, and we were having a conversation about the nature of gratitude. And what struck me, I wasn't going to mention this until just about 10 seconds ago when you asked me. It just kind of came to my mind because it was one of the most inspiring. He was very much connected to the community that you are connected to here. And his response to me about what was happening in his life when everything felt like it was kind of falling down was that he had this tremendous sense of gratitude as a defining principal value that finally in the end of his life shaped how he was looking out at the world. And our last really important conversation was the nature of gratitude, and that has shaped me as a value ever since. So I think he's right about that. And I think I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this. I think this is incredibly valuable, and thank you so much for the invitation to spend an hour and a half together. I'm very grateful for that and for the time.
Thank you. So, Pastor Gail, did you want to talk about our next meeting together, or we'll go right ahead. Take it away.
Take it away. Do we know who?
We don't know who the guest is, but we do know what the topic is. Experience. Mm-hmm.
So, third Tuesday in February, we'll be discussing religion, and it will be experiential. So what are our experiences relating to and living in our religion, and then the religion of what they have called, and I said on Sunday, the other. I thought it was amazing that they used that word. I thought, oh, I was brilliant on Sunday. Look at that. Salute myself. I don't know how to do that. So there is a basket at the back of the sanctuary if you want to leave a love offering for these wonderful gentlemen. So I want to thank you both. Oh my goodness, so much information. These are delightful. My hope is that each one of you in February will bring a friend. That's my hope, because I think these conversations are really important, and obviously we're here. So the first group of people to show up are the people that are all ready to have the conversation, and now it's time to kind of drag those people that are like, oh, I don't want to have that conversation about religion, because that's when it's going to get interesting, and those are the conversations that I think will start to change the drifting sands or the carpet. Maybe one of those people will start to weave a carpet and not even know that they were supposed to. So that's my hope. So we'll pray out, so to speak. Carol, would you like to do that? Thank you.
Wait, before you do that, I have to thank you publicly. From time to time we meet and have lunch, and you introduced Brene Brown's latest book to me, Braving the Wilderness. And it is now, I start in July, somewhere between June and July, teaching all of our doctoral students leading from spiritual depth. And Brene Brown is going to be required reading for all of our Doctor of Ministry students in leading from spiritual depth. And I want to salute you for sharpening my iron in that way publicly. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank both of you for the contribution that you've made to our discussion today. And I just find it really powerful and moving. And if I can ask a question, it's the one that we ask on the third meeting, and that is, what am I to do? Okay. So thank you all for being here. Just take a deep breath together and express gratitude for this time and this place and people who and all of us, everyone who's given up their time and their talents to be here tonight in this very important and very special sharing. I release these words into the law and knowing that it is all good, and so it is.